Hi, I'm Keith Weiner, CEO of Monetary Metals, and today in this video I want to talk about what will the coming gold standard look like. So I have 6 items on my agenda. First is there are 2 pseudo gold standards that I want to talk about and frankly need to be dispatched. Number 2, what are people trying to accomplish? What do they need to do by use of a monetary system? Number 3, who's the banker and what is his role? What does he do? Why is he important? Number 4, how does gold circulate? What does it take to actually make the stuff move and flow in the economy? 5, I want to define what I mean by gold standard. If it's not those 2 pseudo gold standards, what is it? And 6, how do we get there from here? I don't think that's an obvious answer to most people, even people that are interested in the gold standard. So the first pseudo gold standard, we could call it a goldless gold standard. We could call it price fixing. This is the idea that the Fed would somehow determine the right price of gold and then manage the dollar so as to achieve a stable price in gold. The first problem with this is, of course, there is no such thing as a right price. It takes a market to set a price, and the price is going to be moving around. The next problem with this is that the central planners, even if there were a right price, the central planners would be the last people in the world that would get it right. And you can look to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Ludwig von Mises predicted in the 1920s. You can look at North Korea, Cuba, currently Venezuela, and other places to see that when central planning is attempted, they get the price wrong and the results are disastrous for humanity. Everybody forced to live under their boot heel suffers enormously as a result of this. So we certainly don't want to do that. I think the greatest problem, practical problem, with a price fixing scheme for gold is that if you fix the price of gold in dollars, it's okay, now we're going to have a gold standard. That is effectively saying to debtors, this is the price of getting out of your debt. So if you owe, let's say, $100,000 and the price of gold is set at $100,000 an ounce, it takes 1 ounce of gold to get out of debt. If, on the other hand, the price of gold is set at $20, which is what it was valued at before 1913, then it would take 5,000 ounces to get out of debt. And so what I think is going to happen if the country goes down this disastrous course is all of the creditors will line up on one side, all of the debtors will line up on the other side, and it will be the greatest lobbying field day this country has ever seen. What will go on in Washington will be absolutely unbelievable. If you think ordinary pork barrel spending or the politics of military bases is bad, wait till you see what this would be with all the creditors fighting all the debtors. Finally, I think it needs to be underscored that, of course, in a monetary system, prices are set in money terms. If gold is money and a gold standard, gold should be money, then the price of gold is a constant. And so I have this slightly humorous graph showing the price of gold for 5,000 years, and the price of gold is, of course, always 1. Humorous point, but I think there's a very serious principle underlying that. Finally, I want to talk about the disaster that when central banks have tried to fix the price of a currency, it always leads to disaster. Now, typically, in our world, we're familiar with small central banks of peripheral countries, often third world or banana republic countries, and they try to peg their currency to the US dollar very often or very typically, and they say, okay, our peso is going to be worth $1, and they try to hold that line and the market pushes against them, and they say, no, we're prepared to expend all available resources. And so what they have to do is they have to sell dollars and buy their local currency in order to prop up their currency. And they can accomplish that. They can hold the line for a while, but when the market pushes good and hard, either they run out of dollars or they abandon their currency peg. This has happened many times. More recently, we see the example of the Swiss National Bank pegging the value of the Swiss franc to the euro. Now, what was unusual about this case is that they were not trying to hold up the value of the franc, but rather down. Because from the Swiss perspective, the assets they were investing in were largely denominated in euros, and if the euro is going down and the Swiss franc is going up, then their banks are taking losses. So the Swiss National Bank says, we are prepared to, or said at the time, we're prepared to do whatever it takes to hold the franc down in terms of euros. And one would think that this should be very possible because they said we have a printing press, right? So we can print as many francs as it takes. Now we're trying to sell the franc to push the price down against the euro. Well, what happened was in January of 2015, the peg snapped violently, and I think in a matter of milliseconds, the Swiss National Bank lost something like 20% of Swiss GDP, very, very rapidly. And the reason why is they hit their stop loss. So of course it isn't printing, it's borrowing. The Swiss National Bank is borrowing francs from all those people that have demand for it, and then they're turning around and buying euro-denominated assets. So that trade of buying francs and selling francs and buying euros pushes down the franc, pulls up the euro, but it starts to create a bigger and bigger and bigger balance sheet. And that balance sheet is betting on currency, a currency pair, when meanwhile the market wants to push that currency pair in the opposite direction. So eventually the Swiss National Bank cried uncle, they had their stop loss order, and then that peg snapped violently. And so when central banks do this, they set themselves up for failure and cause quite a bit of misery to the people that suffer under these things. In this particular case, businesses and banks suffered by this misadventure. Finally, here's a chart of the money supply showing, wait a minute, no, it's not a chart of the money supply, it's a chart of the gold price. The money supply chart looks nothing like this. And so the final thing that is worth underscoring is that the Fed doesn't actually have control over the gold price in the way that this simple or simplistic, facile, dare I say, theory that okay, if the price of gold is going too low, you just print more dollars, and then the price of gold will go up. Well, the experience has been since 2011, quantity of dollars isn't falling, and yet the price of gold has fallen quite a lot. And so they don't actually have control over the gold price in the way that one might think. And so this, from every angle you could look at it, this pseudo gold standard, this price fixing idea, is a non-starter. The other pseudo gold theory, this is popular in a different camp, we could call this the so-called 100% solution. Everything has to be either physical gold coin, hard gold coin changing hands, or at best warehouse receipts, and the warehouse receipt is backed by an ounce of gold or whatever fraction thereof sitting there gathering dust on a shelf, literally. And so this is not, of course, how gold standards operated historically, but ignoring that, I want to take a look at some of the problems that a monetary system is trying to solve and show how this so-called 100% solution fails. And so first, this is a picture of a medieval fair. And so what used to happen is merchants would come in wherever there was a crossroads. The merchants would come in from the south and the north and the east and the west, and each would be bringing goods that were common and therefore cheap in their lands to trade for goods that were expensive at home, but cheap from wherever those traders were coming from. So from the south, they might be coming up from Italy. There might be a lot of fish that they'd be bringing. From the north, maybe they were bringing reindeer hides or whatever. From the west, maybe timber. From the east, perhaps spices. And they would all come to this fair and trade. Now, the first problem that one observes in these types of fairs, I believe this is historically documented, is that nobody had the gold in order to buy the merchandise from another merchant. And so everybody would be stuck in the same catch-22. Well, you have to buy my merchandise before I can buy your merchandise. And so what the fair needed to do was develop a system for clearing. And the reason why they didn't have any gold is actually two simple reasons. One is nobody would dare travel with gold on the road, because in those days, of course, they'd kill you for the gold. So it wasn't safe. And number two, every merchant had loaded up on as much goods as they could buy, because going to the fair was a very profitable thing. You wanted to buy as much merchandise as you could, so you could come back with new merchandise that would fetch a high price at home. And so everybody had spent all their gold, and nobody brought gold, or not much, to the fair. So how do you solve this problem of clearing? And so it's documented that they used chits. They would check into the fair. There was some sort of fair master, whoever it was, and the chits allowed them to trade, wool for timber and for fish and so forth, and it allowed a multi-way, an N-way, different set of trades to all clear, and at the end of the fair, everybody added up the chits that they had, and then only the difference, only the delta, would have to be settled, and that even might be settlable in silver. In other words, 5 wagon loads of reindeer hides might be worth just about as much as 6 wagon loads of spice, but with a little bit of silver. And so they'd settle, the whole thing would clear, and then they would go home. Well, you have this problem of clearing in any market where there's a supply chain. So the farmer sells wheat to the miller grinds it up, sells it to the baker bakes it into bread and sells it to the consumer. How is the baker supposed to pay for the bread before the consumer buys it from him? And so if you say everybody has to have hard gold coin, then that means if there's 3, in this example, farmer, miller, baker, there'd have to be 3 sets of hard gold coins that would be in circulation in order to make that possible. Of course, the next problem you encounter is that of seasonal demand changes, and so this slide represents Christmas. So for Christmas, demand temporarily rises. That would mean there would have to be an additional hoard or an additional store of gold coins to buy all of the goods in the supply chain in the months leading up to Christmas in order to have the goods on the shelves ready for consumers to buy them in November and December. The next problem you have is what happens if the supply chain expands? And this is one of the points that goes back to Adam Smith, and certainly we see today in spades, and that is a efficient market as one characterized by an ever-expanding supply chain. It becomes more and more efficient for each company to specialize in a narrower piece of production, and in so doing, goods are produced cheaper, they move to market faster. So what happens in that example? The farmer is selling to the miller is selling to the baker. If all of a sudden you say the baker is now going to be a wholesale baker, and he's going to sell the bread not to the consumer, but to a retail grocer who's also going to sell vegetables and meat and other things. So now you have 4 businesses in the supply chain, and then maybe later the supply chain would expand to a 5th entity, and that would be somebody who's bleaching the flour. If it turns out consumers have a preference for bleached white flour versus natural colored flour. And then later maybe there's another company in the supply chain that's adding banana and nut flavors and so forth. With each expansion of the supply chain, if you had to have hard gold coin standard only, you'd have to keep expanding the gold supply, and of course that's impossible. And so something is not going to work if you insist on doing that. The next question is, did credit expand without banks, and how does that work? And so my example for this is, suppose I lend somebody named John 100 ounces of gold. Now, John isn't borrowing that in order to put the gold in the basement. If all he wanted to do was keep it in the basement, there'd be no point, because he'd have to pay me interest. John is doing that because he wants to do something. Let's say he wants to build a business or a workshop for his business. So John borrows the 100 ounces of gold, and of course he promptly spends that gold on a contractor who's going to build his workshop space out to his specifications. Now the contractor is going to mostly spend it on supplies and labor, and he's going to have some of that gold left. Well, the contractor and the workers and the suppliers all have a certain amount of gold. Now any of them could potentially lend it to somebody else. And so with each iteration of lending, this is the infamous 10-to-1 expansion of the so-called money supply. If all of those parties are lending 90% of what they've received, and they keep only 10% of it, then there's a mathematical equation that says eventually you'll end up with a 10 times expansion of credit as that goes. Notice this can occur completely in the absence of banks. The same exact process, the same iteration, the same expansion, the same multiple claims on based on one base ounce of gold, as it were. There's a fallacy in that, of course, and that is they're not claims on the same ounce of gold. They're not claims in parallel. They're claims in serial. In other words, each loan has to be repaid in series, and eventually, if the whole thing were to unwind, the credit would collapse back down to the 1 ounce that would be repaid. And so here's a picture of JP Morgan, who made a point that I think most people are aware of this in the gold community. He gave testimony before Congress in 1912, and he said, money is gold, nothing else. And he was intransigent at the time, I think a little bit out of phase with where the culture had transitioned by the point of 1912, by the eve of creation of the Federal Reserve. But he insisted, no, money is gold and nothing else. Everything else, in his opinion, and in my opinion, is credit. So of course, this expansion example that I just gave is not an expansion of the money supply, it's an expansion of credit. And there's no particular relationship, no law of the universe or of economics that says that credit must be equal to the quantity of gold that backs it. And in fact, the whole point of credit is that it can expand when it's done honestly and when it's done properly, which we don't have today. But it can expand, and that's what allows an economy to grow beyond a medieval subsistence village with 50 farm families, a blacksmith, a cooper, a cobbler, is the expansion of credit. So what's the goal of a monetary system? As in most things in economics, people are trying to coordinate their activities. Different people are trying to accomplish different things. They have different careers, they're in different phases of their career, different walks of life, different ages. People are trying to accomplish the things that they want to do, such as working and eating and buying luxuries and saving for retirement and living in retirement. That's what we're trying to enable. And so let's talk about the wage earner. Obviously, he wants to get paid wages. That depends on his company being able to get financing. But the point here is that everybody knows, we all know that we're mortal. And part of being mortal is that we're going to reach a time that is called senescence. We can no longer work. So we have to save now while we're relatively young, or when we are young, to the point so that we can accumulate something so that when we reach the age of retirement, today it's 65, historically it would have been younger than that. Maybe in the future it'll be older than that. But we know we're going to get to the point where we can't work. We have to save now against that day. The retiree is, of course, living in retirement. Now notice both of these, and so the worker becomes a retiree at some point. Notice both have a need for interest. Without interest, and this is how the world was after the fall of Rome, certainly, through at least the Renaissance and maybe a bit beyond, without interest, what are these people supposed to do? How are they supposed to accomplish their goals? And the only thing they can do is hoarding. So people used to use salt for this purpose. Later, silver became was better than salt, certainly. Salt is not perishable, of course, but if it gets wet, it's ruined. It can be lost. In a flood, silver doesn't really is not really harmed by water. And so, in absent of interest, the worker is accumulating. He's taking, let's say, 10% of his wage, setting that aside, hoping that's enough, hoping he can work long enough. He gets to the age of retirement, and then he stops working, and now he has whatever hoard that he's managed to accumulate, and then he starts dishoarding, and he starts to sell a little bit at a time to pay for groceries while he's retired. And of course, notice now that he has to live in desperate fear, and it would be a desperate fear, of running out of money or outliving his savings, living too long, outliving his money. And so, in those days without a welfare state, if you outlived your money, you became the beggar on the church steps. And I don't think anybody wants to be there. So without interest, this is the fate of man. It's not a particularly pleasant one. And of course, while you're working, if you can't get interest, it's very hard to accumulate very much. I'm just old enough to remember when I started my career, the standard advice was set aside 10% of your wage and literally put that in the bank. And by the time you turn 65, you would have, whatever the number was, $1.5 million. Most of that, 85 to 90% of that, was the compounded interest. Einstein is famous to have said, I believe this is true, could be an urban legend, but I believe it's true, that the most powerful force in the universe is compounded interest. So you get to retirement, you now have $1.5 million, and of course the goal is to live on the interest on that $1.5 million, not to consume the principal. And so, if you could live forever, if medicine advances, you can continue to live because you're clipping the coupon, you're earning interest, and using that to pay for your living expenses. Today, of course, the Fed and the central banks have waged a war on interest. The war is largely over. It's all over about the shouting, and there's no interest to be had anymore. Finally, this last slide is a picture of the entrepreneur. Now, what does the entrepreneur have to do with all this? The entrepreneur is the one who's paying that interest. And why is he doing that? He's not doing that out of altruism. The entrepreneur is paying interest because he's financing a business. And notice what a win-win-win deal this is all around. This is a deal that the entrepreneur gets the financing to build his business. The worker gets, or the wage earner gets interest to compound while he's working, and the retiree gets interest to live in retirement, in exchange for which the entrepreneur is not only building a business that's profitable for himself, but the profits come from creating something new. He is now adding a new product and a new service to the market, and everybody gets richer when somebody invents, whether it's the fire, whether it's the wheel, whether it's the iPhone, whether it's the internet. Every business that creates something new enriches everybody that encounters it or that uses it or consumes it. And so this is interest is literally one of the forces that moves civilization forward. And so when the central banks have waged war on interest, they've literally slammed the forces of civilization into reverse. I talk about this a lot more in my yield purchasing power talk, which is also on video. So let's talk about the banker now. And so everybody assumes the banker is just this evil person, this exploiter. Unfortunately, Aristotle, for all the things he got right, thought that interest was unnatural. St. Thomas Aquinas was not a fan of interest. During the medieval period, interest was often banned as usury, as an evil exploitation. What is the banker really doing? I mean, is he just out to hurt everybody and exploit everybody? No, he is the market maker in the interest rate market. And so this slide here is showing two people that want to make an exchange. But of course, in most cases, especially in a large economy where there's millions of people spread across, hundreds or thousands of square miles, they don't know each other directly. It's the market maker's job, the banker's job, to find everybody that has savings they want to lend, and to find everybody that has a business that needs to expand, perform due diligence, standardize the terms and conditions, aggregate a whole bunch of investors across each deal, aggregate even small investors across a large number of deals, so that nobody's exposed, nobody has 100% exposure to one business, and then glue that market together. And that is what the banker is doing. And so the banker is key to the interest rate market. So moving on, what does it take gold to circulate? So I cribbed this slide of circulation in the human body as kind of an analogy for it. Suppose I want to borrow your gold, and I'm going to pay you 0%. Will you lend it to me? The answer is not just no, but frankly, hell no. At 0%, which is of course where we are today, at 0%, gold is for hoarding only. So I have this very famous or infamous picture of Scrooge McDuck swimming and diving into his hoard of gold. And so that's exactly where we are today. Gold is for hoarding only. We have buying and selling of gold, but that's not circulation. Gold is really not largely used to make payments. Gold is used, people try to use it to store value, to hedge against systemic risk and so forth, to speculate against the rising price. But it should be underscored, if we're talking about the gold standard here, and not the dollar standard where people are being harmed by central banks and their central planning, and they're trying to figure out how to minimize the harm. But if we're talking about the gold standard, there is no buying and selling of gold. Do we talk about buying and selling dollars? It just doesn't make any sense. The whole concept is inapplicable in the gold standard. So what we mean by circulation is not buying and selling, but actually moving around. And so I make an analogy to human bone. So everybody thinks of, you have your arm bone has a certain length and a certain mass and so forth, and they assume that the bone is constant. And this assumption, by the way, occurs many times in economics, that something is constant or steady state or a game theory equilibrium, an economic equilibrium. But in a living organism, such as a mammal, the bone itself, which appears to be the most stable thing. I mean, everybody understands you gain and lose weight, you gain and lose muscle, but the bone, appears to be stable. But there's two processes that are constantly going on within that bone tissue. And one is the process of bone resorption. The body is constantly breaking down and removing bone mass. And then, of course, there are bone cells that are constantly adding new bone mass. And so resorption and new bone growth have to be not equilibrium, but the two rates have to match. So one process is going down, the other process is going up. And as long as those have a matched rate or a matched force, then the bone mass doesn't go anywhere, and your bone tissue remains normal. Well, in the economy, the same thing is happening in gold. If people are saving, if people have a demand for money, they are pulling gold coins out of circulation and they're putting them under the mattress, literally, or putting them under the floorboards or into a safe. There has to be another force that is pulling the gold out of hoards, out of mattresses, out of floorboards, and back into circulation. And the only force capable of doing that is interest. And so my analogy here, this is a valve in a plumbing system. If you have a plumbing system, you will not get flow of water through the plumbing system unless the valve is open. And my analogy here is that interest is the regulator of flow of gold in the economic system. If you have zero interest on gold, it isn't going to flow, it is going to be pulled out of circulation and into private hoards. And the reason is, once you have, everybody has a certain amount of gold they want to have in hand, and that's normal and that's proper. But once you have that amount, there's something that's better than owning the gold coin itself, and that is owning a high quality, yield paying, gold bagged asset. And that's what made the gold standard go around, is that. And so what's the definition of the gold standard? I offer to you an informal, this is not a monetary science, economic theory definition. It's not a formal definition. This is an informal working definition of the gold standard. And that is when anybody who wants to can deposit gold and earn interest on their gold in gold, then that's the gold standard. That, in my opinion, is the thing that we're trying to get to from where we are today, where people can't use gold for savings. They can use it for hoarding only, and they try to use the failing dollar for savings, but it isn't working for them, and they can't earn interest in it anymore. And so the dollar itself has become either for hoarding or for speculation. People want to figure out what's the next great bubble going to be, whether it's Bitcoin or something else. So how did we get from here to there? Today we have a lot of gold. This is the irony of this. People say, we don't have enough gold to have a gold standard. Now, usually that's just a knee-jerk reaction. They're economically ignorant. They don't really know anything about history or where we came from, or what causes anything, and they just snap that out. And then you're just supposed to just lamely, respond to that, and then they can laugh at you. If you look at historically how much gold was in London at the time when the world's monetary and trade system was run out of London in the late 19th century, you see that they had about 150 tons of gold in London. To put that in perspective and for point of reference, the state of Nevada today produces 160 tons of gold per annum. So that is, Nevada is producing more gold annually than London had at the peak of the gold standard. And so it's not a matter of quantity of gold, nor is it a matter of price. I want to, a lot of gold people will say, well, you just have to reprice the gold and then everything works. In the gold standard, the price of gold isn't going up. There is no price of gold. The price of gold is one. And so I just want to observe, 20 years ago, the price of gold was a heck of a lot cheaper than it is now. And gold did not circulate when the price was under $300. Gold did not circulate in 2011 when the price was $1,900. Gold is not circulating today when the price of gold is in the vicinity of $1,250, $1,260. And gold will not circulate even if it hits whatever fantasy number promoted by the gold bugs, whether that's $5,000 an ounce, $20,000 an ounce. I just came back from Freedom Fest, and one of the speakers was promising, yes, you guessed it, $65,000 an ounce for gold. No matter what, or if any or all of these price targets are hit, gold will not circulate. It is not a matter of price. That is the wrong response to the Keynesian or the monetarist who sneers there's not enough gold. What it does take for gold to circulate is interest. Interest allows the gold coin to circulate, and in the movement of the gold, accomplish multiple people's ends at the same time. And so the borrower is saying, okay, let me borrow the gold, let me spend it in order to buy a capital asset. He spends it, and then the worker is paid, and the worker is now saving it, which is financing something else. And so you can get an economic expansion. There is no particular quantity of gold. However, the amount of gold that you need is as a function of 1 over the interest rate. So at zero interest, it is correct today to observe that the demand for gold is a black hole. No matter how much gold comes out of the gold mines, no matter how much gold is recycled, it all disappears. None of it goes into circulation. But it's a matter of the interest rate, not the price of gold, but the interest rate on gold, that will determine how much gold you really need. And so there's a famous incident, not as famous as it should be, where somebody supposedly came up to JP Morgan during one of the banking panics, either the late 19th century, early 20th century, and said, Mr. Morgan, there's a crisis in New York. There's a shortage of gold. What are we going to do? And JP Morgan said, raise the interest rate. 4%, he said, we'll draw it off the continent. Now think in those days of the time it took to get a steamer across the ocean, the cost, the risk, and everything else. 4% would be enough for the Europeans to be motivated to send their gold. 5%, he added, will pull it down off the moon, which of course was pure hyperbole around 1900. Nobody could have imagined flying to the moon. And so Morgan understood something, and I think his audience in those days would have been expected to understand something that today has been lost, today has been forgotten. And that is its interest that governs whether gold is coming into the market or whether gold is being pushed out of the market. And 4% he thought was more than high enough to pull it into the market in the conditions that he had in those days. That may or may not be the conditions that we'd have to have today. So how do we get from here to there? A lot of people tend to think in top-down terms. We have to go to Congress, we have to lobby Congress to do something. Well, what is it we're going to lobby Congress to do? Well, then obviously, now you break into different camps. We have to lobby Congress to prohibit fractional reserve banking. We have to lobby Congress to have the Fed fix the price of gold or whatever it is. I certainly think there's some legislation that we need, one of which I've been involved in lobbying for at the state level, and that's repealing the capital gains tax on gold, which I think is just evil, it's just wrong. But I think the top-down approach is not likely to give us the gold standard. I do have one proposal that I've written as a paper, and that is how to use the gold bond to avert financial Armageddon, in which I propose that the U.S. Treasury issue gold bonds. But in a certain sense, this is not a top-down solution to the gold standard. This is a solution to how the U.S. government gets out of debt. I think we need a bottom-up approach to getting to the gold standard. And that is, and this is what Monetary Metals is involved in, finding companies that are doing something productive with gold, financing them in gold, and paying investors interest on gold. It's interest that's going to be the key to the whole thing. And so logically, it makes sense that the payment of interest is where you start. You find those opportunities, you bring those opportunities to investors. The more investors that get involved in it, the more businesses who see the advantages of financing themselves in gold, then the whole process begins. And from there, we move to the gold standard. I can be reached, Keith at monetarymetals.com. Thank you for watching.